Good day, everyone. This is where we're going to be tomorrow, weather permitting. So this is Port Stanley. So it's probably a good time to talk about the history of the Falkland Islands. Now, historians agree that there was no indigenous population in the Falkland Islands, and the first people that went there were actually Europeans. But no one can really agree on who those first Europeans were, whether it was the Portuguese or the Dutch. At one stage, a British ship captured a French ship which had on board a Portuguese map which showed some islands down here to the south, and it was thought so the Portuguese might have been here first. But to just give you a little bit of a history of the area, going back a lot further. Now, back in the late 13th century, Marco Polo travelled from his home in Venice across Europe, across what was known as Persia, and then across to the Far East, and discovered the riches of China and India and the Spice Islands. And he came back after 24 years of travel, and he wrote a book, The Travels of Marco Polo. And in this book, he started talking about the people he'd met, the things he'd seen, and he talked about riches that were beyond any man's imagination in this area of the Far East. Now, a lot of people had a lot of imagination back there, and this started what was known as the Silk Road, the caravans of the Silk Road, to get these riches, these spices, these silks, and porcelain from this region. But in the year 1493, the Ottoman Empire invaded and they conquered the city of Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, and they closed the Silk Road to all Christians. So it meant that Europeans had to find another way of getting to this area of the Far East. And this was the genesis of what was known as the Age of Discovery. And in that Age of Discovery, people like Columbus, it meant that kings and queens who wanted the power and the riches of the Far East were keen to sponsor voyages of discovery. Merchants who had made a lot of money out of these goods from the Far East were prepared to put money up to go searching for a route to get there. Sea captains who had just been content with going around the coastlines of the Mediterranean, around the coastlines of Europe, now became explorers searching the oceans. And in around about the year 1492, Columbus went across the Atlantic and he discovered the Americas. He thought he was in India, so he called the local people Indians. And then a couple of years later, Magellan, he sailed down and around the coastline of South Africa, and he discovered a route to get to India through the Indian Ocean. Now, at this time, around about the late 15th century, there was a lot of Portuguese and Spanish sailors travelling through the Atlantic, searching that region. There was a lot of potential for conflict between Portugal and Spain. So the Pope at the time, a man by the name of Pope Alexander VI, who was infamous for the number of mistresses he kept, including a lot of prostitutes, some of them who actually lived at the Vatican, and for the number of illegitimate children that he had sired, he decided that he couldn't have conflict between his two great Catholic superpowers. So he negotiated what was known as the Treaty of Tordesillas, which split the world in two down the line of 73 degrees of latitude. And this was in 1494. And everything to the in the yellow there to the west, which was the Americas that Columbus had discovered for Spain, and the ocean beyond that, the Pacific Ocean, that was going to belong to Spain. And everything to the east of that line of Tordesillas, so that was Africa, and the Indian Ocean that Vasco da Gama had discovered was going to belong to Portugal. Now, the other emerging marine powers of that time, the British, the French, and the Dutch, they didn't recognise the Treaty of Tordesillas, but the Argentinians still use this Treaty of Tordesillas as justification today for their claims to the Falkland Islands, which are in Spanish territory, according to this treaty. Now, in 1592, so this is 100 years after Columbus arrived in the Americas, a British sea captain was down in this region. He was blown off course and he came to these islands. His name was Captain John Davies and his ship was called the Desire. He claimed these islands for the British at that time, and the flag of the Falkland Islands still features the ship, the Desire, and it's on the official crest as well. And the official motto of the Falkland Islands is "Desire the Right," which is about the ship, the Desire. So this is the Falkland Islanders saying that this was the first ship to come here and to claim this region. So the British own these islands because of the first right of discovery. But we'll cover a bit more about that a bit later on. Now, this is the Falkland Islands here. Now, later on, a man by the name of Captain John Strong was sent down to the islands to chart these islands. This trip was funded by Lord Falkland, who was the Secretary of the Admiralty at that time. So when Strong got down here on his vessel, the Welfare, he named that channel between the two main islands the Falklands Channel in honour of Lord Falkland. And then eventually the islands became known as the Falklands. Lord Falkland later became the first Lord of the Admiralty, but he was later sent to the Tower of London on a charge of peculation, which is misappropriation of government funds or public funds. He contracted smallpox in the Tower and later died of that, which sums up the Falkland Islands in a lot of ways. Now, the very first people to colonise the Falklands were actually the French, who really had no right to do it. This was done by a man by the name of Bougainville. Now, he was a great French general during the 7 Years' War. He was the second in command of French forces during the siege of Quebec in present-day Canada. Now, he transferred to the Marine Royale, or the French Navy. He became an admiral in the French Navy, and he's famous for leading the very French first circumnavigation of the world. And this circumnavigation was probably the 13th circumnavigation of the world at that time, but it's famous for the fact that the very first woman to circumnavigate the world, a woman by the name of Jeanne Beret, was on this journey. She was the lover and the assistant to the chief scientist, a man by the name of Philbert Commerson, and she came on board disguised as a man and stayed with Commerson, and eventually she became the first woman to circumnavigate the world. But this was how New France looked back before the 7 Years' War. All that area in blue was New France. The area to the right there in the coral, that's the 13 American colonies at that time. Now, I just wanted to concentrate on this area here, which was known as Acadia. And this is a bit of a close-up of that area. This was colonised by people who came from that border area between France and Spain. They'd been driven out of there by conflict in that region. They came to this region of New France and they settled there. And all they wanted to do was be left alone and fend for themselves. So when that 7 Years' War happened between Britain and France, which was fought a lot of battles in what we now know as Canada, they stayed out of it. Probably completely out of it. There may have been a few people that fought for France, but when the British won that war, they demanded that the Acadian people swear allegiance to the British Crown. The Acadians refused. They said, we don't care about anyone, we just want to be left to ourselves. Now, that wasn't good enough for the British, so they decided to expel the Acadians and send them elsewhere. Some of them went back to France, some of them went to present-day Mauritius, some of them went down to the only other French territory in the Americas at that time, which was Louisiana, and the Acadian people became the Cajun people of Louisiana. But Bougainville felt very, very sorry for these people, that they'd been kicked out of their homeland. And during that circumnavigation of the world, he had gone to the Falkland Islands. So he decided to relocate some of those Acadian people to the Falklands. So they sailed down and they went to, they claimed, they set up a settlement here. And they came to this area over here in 1764, over to a place that they named Port Louis. And they called the island the Malvines. Now, later on, the Spanish would change that to the Maldivas. Now, This colony didn't last very long because the French and the Spanish were allies at that time. And the Spanish king went to the French king and said, hang on, you guys have set up a colony in what we consider our territory. There'd been no Spanish ships at that time ever go to the Falklands, but because it was in Spanish territory, as per the Treaty of Tordesillas, the Spanish wanted the French to leave. So Bougainville had to dismantle his settlement and relocate those Arcadian people elsewhere. But in the meantime, the year after, in 1765, a Captain John Byron for the British sailed down to this region. He sailed into a harbour on the west island of the Falklands. He called that Port Egbert. And in his diary, he wrote about this magnificent harbour which could shelter the whole British fleet and would be protected from winds from any direction. And he recommended that a settlement be set up there. Now, Captain Byron, he was on his ship, the HMS Dolphin, which became a famous ship because it was the first ship to circumnavigate the world twice. He went on to have a magnificent career in the Navy. He became an admiral. But some of you may have already heard of Captain John Byron because he was a midshipman on the vessel the Wager. And a lot of you have spoken to me about the Wager. You would have heard about this. He remained loyal to his captain, and after many trials and tribulations and hardships, he eventually made it back to England. He wrote his account of that voyage, and David Graham used that in his great book about the Wager. His grandson was Lord Byron, the great English poet. Now, just as a bit of a side, one of the midshipmen on the HMS Dolphin, when he came down in 1765, was a man by the name of John Noble. We talked about Byron's grandson. John Noble had a famous grandson himself, and that grandson went on to captain the Royal Mail ship, the Taylor. Now, the Taylor is often called the first Titanic, or the Victorian-era Titanic. It was a clipper ship, a beautiful, fast, they were very sleek ships, very fast ships, and there was a lot of similarities between the Taylor and the Titanic. Both ships were built by the White Star Line. Both were promoted as being absolutely unsinkable, and both failed to complete their maiden voyages. The Taylor had been built to go from Liverpool on the very lucrative route all the way out to Melbourne, Victoria in Australia, because gold had been discovered in Victoria. And just like the Californian gold rush, hundreds of thousands of people from all over the world were rushing to those goldfields to try and make their fortune. Unfortunately for the White Star Line, a lot of the shipbuilders in Liverpool also downed their tools. They went out looking for their fortune. So the construction of the Taylor was delayed for a long period of time, for months and months. Now, this caused a lot of problems for the White Star Line because there was a lot of complaints from passengers who had already paid for their fare, and they wanted to get out to these goldfields for themselves. So when it sailed with 680 passengers and crew on the 19th of January, on its maiden voyage to go out to Melbourne, the White Star Line sort of dispensed with that nitty-picky sort of stuff, like sea trials and crew training and, calibrating the compass. I mean, compasses had always worked before. What's the problem? Steel hull, magnetic compass. What could possibly go wrong? So what went wrong is that the compass showed that they were sailing south into the Irish Sea, when in fact they were sailing west across the Irish Sea, and just less than 2 days into its maiden voyage, it struck the rocks near Dublin, 5 miles south of Dublin Bay. Now, when the dawn broke, they could see they were right on the coastline. So they dropped that main mast, and a lot of the sailors were able to clamber across that mast, carrying ropes with them, and they were able to pull most of the passengers ashore using those ropes. So of the 680 people on board, 380 actually survived. But of the 100 women on board, only 3 survived. And that was because most of those women were dragged down by the very heavy Victorian-era garments of that time. Now, can I just ask, are there any sailors here, or perhaps ex-Navy, ex-Coast Guard, ex-Marines, anyone with any boating experience and things? Put your hand up. Okay, a few? Okay, great. Because I'm going to be relying on your help here, your support, because And it breaks my heart to say this, but there's some cynical people out there in the world that might think that what I'm going to say is not quite true, but it is. I mean, the unfortunate, totally unnecessary deaths of those 97 women who were dragged to their deaths by the weight of that clothing is the main reason, the overwhelming reason why sailors all around the world prefer women to wear as little clothing as possible. It's for safety reasons. Now, seriously, if you see me staring at a beautiful woman, I am probably conducting an occupational health and safety assessment for her. Back to the Falklands. Okay, in 1770 we had our first crisis in the Falklands, and on June the 10th, 5 Spanish warships with 1,400 Marines sailed into to the Falklands, and they decided to kick the English out, the British out. So the British were expelled, and the Spanish now claimed these islands for themselves. And then a few months later, the British came back and they expelled the Spanish, and the British now had control of the whole thing. But then in 1776, there was some trouble with those ungrateful American colonists up in the American colonies, and the British decided that they needed everyone they could, so the British decided that they would leave. Before they left, though, they put a plaque there saying that this land, these islands, belonged to the British, and then they went up to the Americas. And then a few years later, the Spanish returned, and they reclaimed the islands again. They ignored that plaque. But then they were having troubles on their own in 1811. The Argentinians, the Chileans, they were all fighting for their independence against Spain. And Napoleon had invaded Spain by this time. So the Spanish decided that they'd leave and go and help out. And they also left a plaque claiming that these islands were Spain. Now, be careful tomorrow when you're walking around, tripping over all these plaques that have been left behind. Now, eventually, 5 years later, the Argentinians won their independence from Spain, and on the basis that this was Spanish territory under the Treaty of Tordesillas, then if that's the case, then this must be Argentinian territory, and that's the basis for the Argentinian claim today. Now, the Argentinians set up a base there. They put some officials there. These officials became very, very greedy, and that got the Americans involved in the long run. The Falklands was a good base for American and British whaling vessels to come in, to replenish, to get fresh water, give their crews a break after the whaling. And these Argentinian officials decided that they would start levying a tax or a license upon these whaling vessels to come in, and a license for you able to whale within that region. And eventually these taxes became heavier and higher and higher and higher, and eventually the American whalers decided, we're not going to pay this. So these Argentinian officials, they decided to confiscate 3 American whaling vessels, the Harriet, the Superior, and the Breakwater. Now, the Americans complained back to Washington, and so the State Department sent down the USS Lexington to this region. Now, the Americans didn't recognise that this was Argentinian territory. The captain of the Lexington said, as far as we're concerned, you've taken these vessels illegally. That's piracy. Piracy is a capital offence. We could have you hung. Now, luckily for those Argentinian officials, they were just expelled from the island, and the Lexington destroyed all the Argentinian infrastructure there. But the Argentinians came back the following year. They'd seen penal settlements set up in places like French Guiana or Devil's Island and in Australia, etc. And they wanted to have their own penal settlement here in the Falklands. So they sent some troops over to set up this penal settlement. Now, the conditions were so bad at that time that the Argentinian troops mutinied against their officers. They killed a lot of their officers. Later on, they were put on trial and they were executed as well. So the penal settlement didn't get off to a good start. But a few months later, the British came back again and they expelled all these Argentinian forces. But they said to the Argentinian civilians that you're welcome to stay as long as you stay here in peace. And then they set up a British permanent establishment there. And in 1845, they made Stanley, or Port Stanley, the capital of the Falklands. Now, it became quite a useful place for vessels who were going around the Horn, Cape Horn. Now, we went around there yesterday, and it was very, very easy, obviously, with engines, etc. But back in the day of sail, this was, as we heard, a very, very dangerous place. If you had these gales down there, you could take weeks and weeks to be beating against these winds before you could actually get around the Cape. So Port Stanley became quite a handy place for people to come down. If they're coming down the Atlantic, they'd stop in there, they'd give their crews a rest, they'd get fresh water and food before they'd start the journey. And it was a good way for you coming from the Pacific into the Atlantic to stop off there to do repairs to your ships, give your crews a break, and once again replenish or do any repairs to the ships. But all that became redundant when the Suez Canal opened in the Panama Canal opened in 1903. The Cape Horn, the Drake's Passage, wasn't used very much after that. The Panama Canal was used more and more. So Port Stanley became a bit of a backwater once again. Now, during World War I, the German Admiral Maximilian von Spee came down. He defeated a British fleet off the coast of Chile, and he was raiding British commercial vessels down here. So the British sent a battle fleet down to try and find Graf Spee. Graf Spee decided that he would cruise into Port Stanley and destroy the British infrastructure there, their communication facilities, etc., that were there. Now, unfortunately for him, when he sailed towards Port Stanley or into Port Stanley, that British battle fleet had arrived the day before, and they were replenishing. And as the British opened fire when they saw the Germans, and as we tender in tomorrow, on the left-hand side as you're going into Port Stanley, you'll see Canopus Hill, and that was named after HMS Canopus, who fired the first shots during this battle. Now, the German fleet, the battle fleet, was basically destroyed by the British. Admiral Graf Spee, his two sons, and about 2,200 German sailors were killed during the battle, and some of these ships still line the coastline of the Falklands. And you can see more about this at the museum in Port Stanley. There's a good display there. But the battleship, the Admiral Graf Spee, was named after this great German hero. And as I said yesterday, you'll see that was the first ship involved in a battle during a naval engagement during World War II, and we'll see elements of that ship when we go into Montevideo next week. Now, there's been some other conflicts out here between Argentina and Britain over the years, and in 1948 there was a battle of Deception Island. Now, Deception Island is down here. It's once again disputed territory between Britain and Argentina. It's down near the Arctic. And it's a very handy place to go because that bay there, Hope Bay, that's actually part of a volcano, and it's still an active volcano. So the water within that bay never has any ice in it. It's very warm water. So it's a handy place for people to go down, stop off there on their way to and from Antarctica. In fact, the pools around that bay are a bit like a spa. You can go and have a lovely hot spa in there. But in 1948, the British had a base there. The Argentinians sailed in. They captured the British base and they expelled the British. And then a few weeks later, the British came back and they expelled the Argentinians. We've got a theme going here. And 4 years later, exactly the same thing happened. The Argentinians sailed in. They fired shots at the British and forced the British out. A couple of weeks later, a British warship from the Falklands came in, and once again, they expelled the Argentinians. Before they left, though, they had to make a public apology. And then in 1953, the Argentinian president, Juan Perón, went to the British and offered to purchase the Falkland Islands on behalf of Argentina. Now, after a while, the British said, no, thank you, we're quite happy with them, we'll keep them, thank you very much. And the British used the fact that an Argentinian president offered to buy the islands as justification for, they're our islands. I mean, why would the president of Argentina offer to buy them if they were Argentinian, for example? So that's part of their argument as well. And then in 1960, we had the United Nations get involved, and this was Resolution 1514, which basically got rid of all the colonies of the world. It granted independence to colonies, and part of that resolution was that foreign rule was a violation of human rights. It affirmed the right for self-determination and called for the end to all colonial rule. Now, it went to a vote at the UN, 89 for, none against, but 9 countries abstained, including Australia, Belgium, because they had their own colonies in the Belgium Congo, the Dominican Republic for some reason, France, Portugal, Spain because of their overseas colonies, South Africa, United Kingdom and the United States because of the colonies in Guam and Wake Island, etc. But that resolution was passed by the UN. So in 1964, Argentina took their case to the UN saying that this was a British colony. It shouldn't be a colony at all. It should be independent, and we should be allowed to go there as well. Now, the British put in their submission, the Argentinians put in theirs. It went backwards and forwards, reams and reams and reams of paper over the years. And in the true tradition of the United Nations, they declined to take a stance on the matter. So it's still going. And then in 1966, we had a little bit of a farce. On September 28th, there was 18 Argentinian university students on an internal flight within Argentina, and they hijacked the plane carrying 45 passengers. They demanded that the pilot fly to Port Stanley, where they landed on the playing field there. They walked up to nearby Government House, and they demanded that they said they weren't leaving until the islands became part of Argentina again. Now, the governor of the Falklands at that time and the chief constable negotiated with these university students, and they offered themselves as hostages in exchange for the other hostages aboard the plane, and that eventually happened. So the governor and the chief constable spent a very uncomfortable night aboard this plane in freezing conditions, along with these 18 university students, and then the next day, the university students, after suffering through that very long, cold night, said, well, we've made our point. We no need to take this any further. Don't need to. So all the passengers were put on board the flight. They flew back to Argentina, and they became national heroes back in Argentina. And then, of course, in 1982, we had the Falklands War. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the actual battles. I just want to tell you, you'll see a lot of that over the next couple of days. Just wanted to tell you a little bit about the background to it. So in 1982, Argentina was ruled by a military junta under the command of the General Galtieri, who was the president of Argentina at that time. Now, this was a very, very unpopular government. They'd been responsible for the Dirty War, where up to 30,000 Argentinians disappeared, were just taken by agents of the state, and they disappeared. There was also a lot of an economic collapse. The country was in absolute economic crisis at that time. But there was also in 1978, they had the Beagle dispute with Chile, which almost led to war with Chile. This was about 3 islands in the Beagle Channel, which each country disputed. They belonged to Chile, but Argentina wanted these islands, and they wanted to have access to a port on the Pacific side as well as the Atlantic side. So in the end, the Pope had to come down and intervene in these discussions, and he came down on the side of Chile, and these islands remain Chilean today. But this was a great embarrassment to this government of Argentina, and the people were very disappointed with this outcome. Now, this government had very close ties with the CIA. That were a very right-wing leaning government who were helping the CIA with their battles against the Contra rebels in Nicaragua, etc. Now, the English weren't doing themselves, or the British weren't doing themselves any favour either. There was an official report from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office saying that, recommending that the islands of the Falklands be ceded to Argentina. These islands aren't doing anything for us, they're costing us money. if we ceded them to Argentina, it would help with the very important trade negotiations we have with Argentina, because Britain was very reliant on Argentina for things like beef and other agricultural products. And the Foreign Office thought that if the negotiation would go a lot smoother if these islands were given back to Argentina. Now, when the local MP for the Falklands found out about this, he railed against it in Parliament, but it became public, and the Argentinians found out about this and gave them some ideas as well. But the Thatcher government also didn't help. They, in their budget they brought down, they were trying to cut costs. So they said that they were going to withdraw the only war ship in the region, HMS Endurance, and send that back to England. And they were going to sell HMS Invincible, one of their 2 aircraft carriers, to Australia for $1 billion. Now, I was in the Australian Navy at the time, and we were wondering, why are we buying a second-hand aircraft carrier that's designed for the Northern Hemisphere to come down and serve in the Southern Hemisphere? We can do better, but I mean, that was what was going to happen at the time. But the Thatcher government was very, very unpopular as well. The satisfaction rating for that government in December 1981 was 18%. Dissatisfaction rating was 73%, so they were very unpopular. So on April the 2nd, the most popular thing that government, that junta, could do would be to take back the Falkland Islands. Now, as we'll hear, this was, they planned to do it in September, October, but it was brought forward for various reasons, and they invaded the islands on April the 2nd. The small garrison was overcome by Argentinian special forces, and the islands fell to Argentina. General Galtieri came to the island, to Port Stanley, the next day. They raised the Argentinian flag, and you'll see where this flagpole is tomorrow. And Galtieri went from being a public pariah to a national hero in Argentina for getting these islands back. But the British weren't going to stand for that. And there was a lot of shuttle diplomacy. Now, you have to remember that Argentina was a supporter, it was an ally to America, but so was Britain. So the US was a bit caught in the middle here. A lot of shuttle diplomacy took place. General Alexander Haig, who was the Secretary of State, spent hours in the air flying from Washington to Buenos Aires to London and back again, trying to negotiate, trying to work out a peaceful settlement for all this. But none of it worked. But I mean, there was a lot of opposition to this war, even amongst the British. Sir John Hoskins was a senior advisor to Margaret Thatcher. He had to resign his position. He said, "My fear on the Falklands is that we're about to make almighty fools of ourselves." He didn't think it was possible to take back the islands militarily. And he said it would be sad if Falkland precipitated the downfall of the Thatcher government, and the long-run effect was that the country ended up with an economy unable to sustain proper defence for 56 million people in the UK, rather than 1,800 people in the Falklands. So, as I said, there was a lot of opposition even at that time. But the British decided to send a task force down to retake the islands. They sent 127 ships along the way. Now, they had to come all the way down through the Atlantic. All those negotiations were still happening behind the scenes in the 3 weeks that it took for these ships to get down into position. Now, as I said, the papers were released during that time about the negotiations behind the scenes. And the US Secretary of the Navy went to Ronald Reagan and said that taking back the islands was a military impossibility. And he said to save the British from the fate of what was going to happen to them, what they should do is deny access to the Ascension Islands. Now, the Ascension Islands are actually British territory, but the bases, they've been leased to the United States for several decades, and there's very large American military, Air Force base and naval bases there. And the British were going to need these bases for refueling planes and ships. If they didn't have access to this, then the whole thing was over. Now, the British found out the Americans were considering this in these negotiations. So they said that they would invoke Article 5 of NATO, which says that any NATO country is attacked, all other NATO countries have to respond and support them militarily. The Americans went back and said, but under Article 6 of NATO, that only applies in the North Atlantic above the Tropic of Cancer. So if you're in Florida and you're below the Tropic of Cancer, you're not covered. But the British went back again and said, we are a foundation member of NATO. If you're not going to support us, then maybe NATO isn't worth the paper it's printed on. So eventually the British did get access to those bases in the Ascension Island. The Americans became extremely helpful behind the scenes. We still don't know today exactly how helpful, but afterwards Ronald Reagan received a knighthood, and so did Caspar Weinberg, the Secretary of Defence, received a knighthood from the British government for their services during the war. Now, the hot war got hot on the 2nd of May 1982, where the British nuclear submarine HMS Conqueror fired 3 torpedoes, 2 of it hit the Argentinian cruiser, the General Belgrado. 321 sailors were killed, 2 civilians were killed, and 772 men were picked up by elements of the Argentinian and the Chilean Navy, and they were rescued. The Argentinians responded with aerial warfare. HMS Sheffield was one of the first casualties, but the British were fortunate. There were 13 bombs hit British ships during the war, but that didn't detonate. They'd set the fuses incorrectly. And Lord Craig, who was the head of the Royal Air Force at that time, said that if they had 6 better fuses, the British would have lost the war. As I said, I'm not going to talk a lot about battles, but the British landed. Most of their transport helicopters had been destroyed by the Argentinians during when one of those ships were hit. So they had to tab or march all the way across the island, but you'll hear about that tomorrow. But eventually, on June the 14th, 1982, they retook Port Stanley. The Argentinians had to sign a letter of surrender. All the Argentinian conscripts, the troops, had to march through the town of Port Stanley, being abused by the local inhabitants there. While they were there, the Argentinians had changed a lot of the laws there. They said, okay, well, now you're part of Argentina, you have to drive on the right-hand side of the road. The local Falkland Islands said, we haven't got any roads here that are wide enough for 2 cars, so it doesn't much matter, does it? The fleet returned. There was a hero's welcome for the British fleet. They got the keys to the freedom of the city of London. They marched through, including a lot of the veterans who were horribly wounded during this battle. Now, to the victor goes the spoils. General Galtieri was removed from office. He was charged with mishandling the war. He was sentenced to 12 years of hard labour. Later, an Argentinian president pardoned him. But Margaret Thatcher went from having record low approval ratings to record high approval ratings. And she was later made Baroness Thatcher for her efforts. Now, there was nearly 1,000 men killed during the Falklands War, and many more were wounded during that time. There were 3 civilians killed as well when a British shell fell short and destroyed a house with 3 local ladies in it. And there was one civilian who was injured. He lost his left eye. His name's Tim. If you're doing the Falklands War tour tomorrow, you'll meet Tim and you'll hear the story there. But an American State Department official once said that going to war for political popularity was unconscionable. You shouldn't just do that sort of thing. And it was said that this war was the equivalent of 2 bald men arguing over a comb, which it's funny, but it sort of trivialises the whole thing too. When you've got 1,000 men that have died and many more that have been wounded, both physically and mentally for a long time, you shouldn't probably trivialise it. Now, when you get there tomorrow, you'll see this statue. As you get off the tenders, you walk along the right there, you'll go past some souvenir shops and things, and you'll come to this statue. It's been put up by the local inhabitants of the Falkland Islands, and it says, in memory of those who liberated us. All the names of the men who died fighting the battle are all along there. Now, There were a lot of people in England who wanted to contribute to putting up this monument, but they weren't allowed to. Only Falkland Islands were allowed to contribute, and every single Falkland Islander did. Nearby, you'll see the statue of Margaret Thatcher, who's a hero here in the Falklands, and this is located on Thatcher Drive. There's also an Argentinian cemetery at Goose Green, which is maintained by the citizens there in very, very good order as a tribute to them. They're still finding Argentinian bodies, and last year 6 more bodies were interned in this cemetery. Now, this is a really strange situation. 99.9% of Argentinians have never been to the Falkland Islands. The only people that really go there now are people who have lost comrades there or family members there to go and visit this cemetery. But the Argentinians have been told ever since they were in the cradle that these islands belong to them, that it's not fair, that they're not part of Argentina, and that the world will be a much better place when they return to Argentina. For some reason, and you've all probably seen the sign saying that the Maldives are still part of Argentina, but it's just, yeah, strange. Now, in 2013, the international committee went to the island to conduct a referendum to see what the local people wanted to do. Now, in that referendum, 98.8% of the population said that they wanted to remain as a British overseas territory. If it's up to the local people, that's what they want to do. They don't want to be part of Argentina. In the tours you do tomorrow, the tour guides will tell you it was actually 99.8%, but officially it was 98.8%. Of the 3,187 residents, only 38 voted against it, and they said that they made a mistake filling out their ballot paper. So it's very, very British. It is extremely British sort of place. You'll love it. There's lots of these things around. You'll see this tomorrow. You can get some Falkland Island stamps if you're interested in that sort of thing. It's wonderful. You'll get, when we arrive there by 10, this is the local welcoming committee you'll have there to see you. They'll say hello to you. This is the local pub, the Globe. It's a fun pub. Lots of history in there. We met some British veterans who were there, who'd come back to see where they'd fought all those years ago. We'll probably see you in there tomorrow afternoon. Now, one thing, while we were there last time, we met a man by the name of Menson Bound. He was actually the man that found Shackleton's ship, the Endurance, under the ice in Antarctica. He's a local Falkland Islander. He wrote a book about it, and hopefully we'll be able to contact. We've sent emails to him, and hopefully we're going to try and set up a place where we can meet him and get him to autograph some books as well. But nowadays, tourism is the major economic stimulus for the Falkland Islands. People like ourselves going there on cruise ships, etc. They do have their other main source of income is fishing rights. They don't do the fishing themselves. They sell those rights mainly to Chinese fishing ships, and you might see some of them when we get there tomorrow as well. But it's a great place. I think you'll enjoy it. And the local people are very friendly, and they'll make sure that you feel welcome to the Falkland Islands. Thank you.